As the ground incursion from Israel into Gaza ramps up, many are wondering how this conflict can possibly find resolution and who might lead Gaza when it's over. Yezid Sayigh is a Palestinian historian who was involved in peace talks 30 years ago. I spoke to him on Friday. Yezid Sayigh, nice to meet you. Thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you.
You are calling for a ceasefire, and that is a conversation that seems to be growing around the world right now. How in your mind would that work at this stage, Mr. Sayigh?
Well, the real question is whether the Israeli government will accept a ceasefire. And I think that then is tied to something else, which is we've seen obviously a delay in the full ground offensive. There's been a lot of reports coming out of Israel about disagreement between the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the military command, and I think this is plausible because I feel that the core problem facing the Israeli government on the one side and the military command on the other is that they have no answer for the question of what do we do with Gaza once we've destroyed Hamas or achieved victory, however they define that. What then? How do you stabilize Gaza? How do you allow it to be governed? How do you prevent Hamas from returning? And at the same time, maintain full Israeli control as we've had over the last decades.
That's also assuming, of course, that Hamas would agree to a ceasefire. I wonder how that conversation would even take place. You yourself have said that Hamas has thrown away 50 years of gains made. So what would that look like?
That's a very fair question. I still struggle to work out what Hamas thought they were doing and why they thought that the deliberate slaughter of Israeli civilians, of non-combatants, would help them with their immediate goals, let alone with long-term Palestinian goals of independence and sovereignty. That said, in the immediate situation, it's clear that Hamas held on to hostages, took hostages, because it wanted to negotiate over certain things. So it has an interest in negotiating, regardless of whether one morally agrees or disagrees with that on principle. And so whether they want the release of prisoners, whether they want the full lifting of the 16-year-old Israeli blockade of Gaza, that we have yet to see. But I think that for them, a ceasefire helps them. I'm not thinking simply militarily, but rather in terms of stopping the bloodshed and the awful slaughter of Palestinian civilians. We're talking about over 7,000 dead, a majority of them non-combatants, a majority possibly even of them children. So Hamas has its own interest in a ceasefire, but again, it'll have its eye on what it hopes to achieve, what it hoped to achieve with its 7th of October attack in the first place. And we're going to see that come out, I think, as we hear more from the Americans, maybe the Qataris, about what demands Hamas is making in return for the release of either some hostages or all. At some point, if there is to be a deal for the release of all hostages taken by Hamas and other groups in Gaza, that's when presumably we'll know the full extent of Hamas demands, whether they're still achievable politically because of what they did on the 7th of October or not, is of course another matter.
Well, and do you think they are? I mean, I could see that Israelis might not want to have any back and forth with Hamas. Whether there's a third partner involved in those conversations is another matter. But have they not been completely lost all sense of credibility as an organization, given what happened?
Again, a very, very pertinent question, a very fair one. I think that, yes, at one level, and as you quoted me, I've said that what Hamas did and the fact that, had it just launched a military operation and focused on military targets, I think the dynamics would have been very different internationally for sure. But we are threatened with the loss of all that Palestinians fought for the last 50, 60 years in terms of recognition of their cause, of international support for a Palestinian statehood. But that has been slipping for a long while. The Europeans have backtracked. The American administrations have not done much in practice to make sure that Palestinian statehood came about, or at least to impede Israel from continuing to settle and to colonize occupied Palestinian territories daily since the whole peace process started out exactly 30 years ago.
Let me end on this point, though. Who would an Israeli government speak to at this point? Is it the Palestinian Authority? As we've established, it's probably not Hamas after what happened on October 7th. So who is Israel engaging with, in the past or going forward? That does seem to be sort of the immediate problem for them as well.
That is a problem for everyone, for us all, because the U.S. President Joe Biden is now talking about a serious effort to relaunch a political process leading to a two-state solution. And I wish that were still possible. It's one I worked for, I negotiated for, I still think was, and at least in theory, still is the best possible outcome. It is not politically feasible today. For Israelis, I think, even for Palestinians, although there would be more openness to that where they offered a meaningful process. So today, although now there's this revived interest in the two-state solution, and I think that is very welcome, I fear that it's not going to fly. And so we're stuck with a return to something, not quite the status quo before 7 October in Gaza, but some kind of long-term, maybe very painful status quo. And despite everything, unless Israel goes in and, as Netanyahu promises, kills every member of Hamas, which in itself is not actually a solution to that problem, but Israel is likely, at the end of the day, to still be talking to Hamas and Gaza. And let me just say one last thing here. And again, I don't like this, but Hamas for years has been saying, we won't recognize Israel's right to exist, but we will accept a truce with Israel that could last 200 years. And that may be their game plan, that at the end of all this, they extract concessions that allow normal life in Gaza in terms of access to external markets for people to travel, get medical treatment, to study, that there can be an actual economy. People can have clean water to drink, that there's electricity, and that Hamas could even oversee this if it's given enough concessions or, basic terms of existence in return for assuring a 200-year truce. Again, I can see why that won't fly in Israel today, but at the end of 6 weeks of operations or 6 months of combat, the dislocation of 2.25 million people, whatever horrors are yet to come in Gaza, at the end of all this, Israel doesn't have an answer for, so what do we do with Gaza? And what do we do with 2.25 million people? We don't want to rule them, but we don't want to give them free access to the world. And, both sides are locked into that.
Yezid Sayigh, thank you for your thoughts on this. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.